So we've been looking the last few weeks at baptismal regeneration. And we're looking at this in the context of mysticism. Remember, if you hear the word sacramental, right away the word mysticism should come to mind. The whole intent is that there's some kind of magic going on, whether it's by God or however you want to analyze all of this. There is some mysticism, some things we can't understand. But I studied this word this week in the Bible just out of curiosity. I looked up every instance in the New Testament where the word mysticism is used. And other than one time in the book of Revelation where God says this is still a sealed issue, every one of those mysteries is what? It's explained. Now, if it's explained, is it a mystery anymore? No. And so, in fact, we have every one of these. What we would say the mystery of circumcision is explained. The mystery of baptism is explained. The mystery of the church is explained. All the mysteries are explained. Brian?
Is mysticism and mystery connected?
Yes, mystery is something we don't understand. It's a mystery. So mysticism is essentially any kind of thing. Now, there's all kinds of mysticism. But we're looking right now at the mysticism within Christianity and how Reformed theology, in most cases, are mysticism. You have somebody, you have a discussion with the Calvinist, and when you're all done with it, you've explained your position, he'll say to you what? Well, you don't really understand Calvinism. It's a mystery, and we really can't explain it. It's a mystery. No, it's not a mystery. It's very easily explained in the Bible, and the explanation of Calvinism is that it's wrong. And there's not a mystery at all. But we're focusing on baptismal regeneration. What is baptismal regeneration again? I don't want to wait all morning here. Anybody have a shot?
People think that they get saved by being baptized.
Okay. And what's the concept of regeneration? Regeneration, again, Genesis. Again, the word regeneration, two Greek words put together, paleo and Genesis, meaning again Genesis. So it's a new Genesis, and that new Genesis is a new creation with a new head of that Genesis, a new federal head. Instead of the fallen Adam, we have a last Adam who brings us into the new Genesis. He is the door, and the means that he brings us into that is a spiritual door that comes through that, which is the baptism with the Spirit, not with the water, but with the Spirit. So there is a baptismal regeneration, right? It's just that it doesn't come through water. And the baptismal regeneration says it comes through the sacrament of water baptism. No, there is a baptism with the Spirit, and that trumps water baptism. Water baptism simply portrays the spiritual reality of Spirit baptism. John the Baptist said that I baptize you with water, but there is one amongst you whose shoe latch I'm not worthy to loose, who shall baptize you with the Holy Spirit and with fire. 1 Corinthians 12:13, it says, for by one Spirit are we all baptized into one body. That body is, of course, the new Genesis, typified in every local church. Water baptism typifies that. So all of these things come together with very clear explanations if we simply read the Bible. So obviously, our first slide up here, I think that my wife has, for those who believe in the Genesis account of creation, we understand that God has incorporated procreation as part of the laws of reproduction into creation. Push that arrow up on that one. Take it up. Take it down. Is it working now?
No, I checked it before.
Okay, well, it's things like this happen. It's called the devil. Just push those arrows up or down and see if they'll move it. Get it to work?
Yeah.
Got it? Good. Sometimes it locks up from there and it doesn't. See, if we get enough heads together, and we can get the job done. So why is this important that procreation is part of our understanding and the ongoing work of God in recreation? Because we are to procreate spiritually, right? Just as otherwise we are to bring forth fruit. It's our job, Romans 10:17. How shall they hear without a preacher? We are to procreate. We are to win souls and make disciples. So everything reproduced after their kind or after his kind, Genesis 1:21. Yes, earth and water are part of the ongoing process of procreation, but there's nothing magical or mystical in either one of them. Now, why do we say that? Why is that important to understand? Because there are no creative properties within water or earth. There's procreative properties, but no creative properties. Otherwise, there are things within the earth that help the earth to procreate. You put a seed in the ground, the earth is there. If it's fertile earth, it's watered, all of these things that come forth, the earth will help procreate that. Water has to be part of that. You can plant a seed in the ground, but if it doesn't get wet, doesn't germinate, that will not come forth and bring forth procreation. So, but the pagans believed that there were creative powers within the four elements, you know. So this is a simple example of what happens when we take the knowledge of God as a creator out of the scientific process. The result is fairy tales like evolution and the creation of thousands of religious fertility cults in various forms of pantheism. Sacramentalism, for instance, is a degree of pantheism that's entered into Christianity. So the theory of evolution is nothing more than another form of mysticism or pantheism. Now look at Romans 1:20. We're going to explain this a little bit, a little farther. The concept of the four elements that is worshipped by pantheism, that these are essentially the power of God. John.
So one sentence definition for pagan, for the people who don't know what that is, please?
Well, the main idea of pagan or paganism is the worship or the practice of idolatry in its worship forms. But paganism and pantheism are a little bit different. You don't need a god for pantheism. Pantheism is the concept of that, almost like what we think of today within Christianity as deism. God has set everything in motion. He doesn't interfere. Pantheism is the same thing, only it's paganism. And it is simply the gods interacting with man, and pantheism and paganism, both of these are true. In paganism, the gods will actually reproduce children with human women. And this is part of that. John.
So to be put shortly, it would be fair to say pagans are people who do not believe in God and they don't believe God.
Well, they can believe in a God or forms of
But
gods.
they don't believe in God.
Exactly. They don't believe. In fact, the whole concept of monotheism, there's one God, is offensive to them. They will get very angry if you believe that. And that is essentially what pluralism does today, right? They will ask a fundamentalist, well, is your Christianity the only way someone can get to heaven? And if you say, well, of course, that's what Jesus said, then they'll get what? They'll get very upset with you if you teach that. And I've watched some of these new evangelicals, they tap dance all around that because they don't want to lose their audience. But the fact is, Jesus said that I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me. Now the pagan would say, well, any pathway to God. That's what I call Oprah Winfrey theology, you know. And she's very influential. She probably got a lot more followers than I do, I tell you that. So look at Romans 1:20 here. And this is this whole idea. So he says, for the invisible things of him. Well, who is him here? God, the one true God. The invisible things of him from the creation of the world. Otherwise, we see the Creator by what? What he has created. He's invisible to us. Spiritual beings are invisible to us. But he becomes visible to us by the things he's created. So the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen. What do we know about God from creation?
All kinds of stuff. There's order, there's beauty, there's the whole works.
Okay. There's certainly diversity, right? If you were to create, if you were a mom and dad and you wanted to have perfect children, you'd have them all exactly the same, right? Because that way, if they were all exactly the same, think how much easier it would be to parent them, right? But God doesn't work that way. He didn't work that way in giving you your children either. They're all radically different. Right, Ella? She knows that just from the difference between the rest of the children, right? We all are radically different from one another. And that is how God, that diversity that God, the power of God. We know the power of God. Someone says, well, can your God create something so big that he can't even control it? I said, well, when you get to the edge of the universe and find out where that's at, then I'll answer that question for you. But until then, I think God's pretty much left that answer already. Now, is the universe infinite? I don't know. But they're still looking for the edge of it. The new Webb telescope they sent out, they said a few months ago, we found the edge of the universe. And then about a week later, it said, oh, we were wrong. I guess that wasn't it. It was way beyond what they thought it was. So, yeah, that is a concept that we have. We find out so much about God simply by the fact we have a creation. That is a first argument for an existence of God. If there is a creation, there must be a creator. Otherwise, something does not come from nothing. That does not happen. But yet, that's a explanation of all of this. So now look at this. Being what? Understood by the things that are made. Otherwise, creation is not mystical. We have a very deep theology just in looking at creation. We can learn a great deal about God without ever reading the Bible. And that's a testimony. And what is the first thing we learn here? The things that are made. What is the first thing that we learn? Even his what? Eternal power and his Godhead. What is the Godhead? That there's a triunity in the Godhead. The Father plans, the Son executes the plan, the Spirit is the power of execution. That's the Godhead. There is a triunity in it all. And we know that simply by looking at the number of triunities we have in creation. So that they are without excuse. Who are they? Unbelievers. They're without excuse. Because that when they knew God, otherwise there is a creation, there must be a God. They glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain, empty in their imagination. That's what happens when you ignore the evidence that's there. They became vain in their imaginations, and because they did this, their foolish heart was darkened. Instead of coming out into the light of the knowledge of God, instead their foolish heart was darkened. Now this is what happens when rationalization starts taking place. And we have to admit, and I would think that the Reformed theologians would admit that the vast majority of their theology is rational, not biblical. It's systemic and based upon presuppositions, not biblical exegesis. Otherwise, they don't get it out of the Bible. And you want to have that discussion with them, and they say, well, just show me where you get that in the Bible. Now you, in learning the Bible, should be able to clearly understand the text that they're going to use and explain those texts to them. We did that last week in Acts chapter 3. Now, so here it says in verse 22, professing themselves to be wise, now their rationalism takes them high in their own self-image, pride. What do they become? Fools. And change the glory. Now the glory of God is what we would see of all the attributes of God. If you were to go to heaven and you were to see God on his throne, the thing that you would see, that God is a spiritual being. Of course, Jesus is God now in human form, and that is an eternal aspect of who Jesus is. But if you were to see all of the attributes of God, they would come forth in his glory. Now, we can't see that. God has, by his grace, hidden his glory from us. Because it would annihilate us, would destroy us completely. One day we will be able to see him in his glory after we're glorified. But until then, that can't happen. So they changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into what? An image. Well, we have this God, we can't look at him. No, let's make an image of him. Now, God commanded the Jews not to do that. And what are they going to use to pattern their image? We make an image in the likeness of what? Corruptible man. We create God in our image instead of God creating us in his image. And then birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. You know what I call that? I call that creepy theology. That's a creepy stuff. But it's practiced all over the place today. How many gods does Hinduism have? They can't count them all. They don't know how many gods they have. They have temples all over India. Thousands of temples, and kind of like we have churches, but even more. Massive, huge, expensive temples. And the reason why they have so many, because they're to different gods. You might worship a monkey, and they'll have a monkey temple, and that temple will be just full of monkeys. And literally, they feed them. They take, and the monkeys grow without any interference at all, and they just strip the crops and eat everything in sight, and it's bizarre. So as these idolatrous and pagan fertility cults, that's what most of these were, evolved, they took of the form of numerous idols representing the pagan gods that they believed controlled, here it is, the magic of fertility. That was primarily what paganism was a fertility cultus. Now, various kinds of sacrificial systems were developed to appease. That's why I don't like the word appeasement rather than propitiation. God is not appeased. Appeasement has to be done over and over and over again. And that's how we know that is how the mystic Christians apply the sacrifice of Christ. He has to be re-sacrificed. They're appeasing God over and over again. But no, that's not true. That's why Hebrews chapter 10, 10, 12, 14, and 18 are so critically important. By one offering he hath perfected forever them that are sanctified. So, they try to manipulate or appease the pagan god to release the magic of fertility through rain and the flooding of the river plains such as the Nile in Egypt. That's why the Nile River or the plain of Jordan were so important within the pagan fertility cults. Because every year the rivers flooded and they brought all of this rich soil. Most of it was volcanic from the mountains, washed down into the fertile valleys, fertilized all of that, and they had abundance of crops. But they thought there was some magic involved. So these pagan sacrificial practices became bizarre and gorier as they evolved. You go in and study the Mayans, some of these in the South America, many of them practiced both human sacrifice and cannibalism. They ate the people they sacrificed. In the Mideast, Moloch, Baal were primarily known for requiring infant sacrifices. Israel even began to do that. And that is why one of the reasons why God brought them into Babylonian captivity. So they developed into bloodlettings in certain areas, otherwise they'd cut themselves and they'd bleed. Animal sacrifices, even human sacrifices. Usually children and young virgins were predominant because there was purity involved in all of this. Now, all of these various rituals and sacrifices were to compel the pagan gods to release the magic water that had the power to regenerate. That's paganism. You can't read books on paganism without finding that baptismal regeneration was a major part of their religious practices. Now, in their religious practices, you had to be regenerated over and over again. In Scripture, you were regenerated once. So these various rituals were usually chronological, with the cycles of the years and events were all scheduled according to the movement of the sun, the moon, the planets, and the stars. And what came out of that in paganism? Astrology. Astrology is the study of the movement of the stars. Why do we have star charts and the movement of the sun? And why are they so preoccupied with where the sun is going to be and finding out where that is exactly during the sun or the moon and all of these cycles? Well, because this is how they believed that magic was being released. The magic of the gods was being released into the world. And so all of these cultic practices developed out of all of these cycles of the years. Now, quite frankly, they have this down to a science. Some of those old charts that they have found archaeologically are as accurate, and some of them even more accurate than what we have today. And they didn't have the instrumentality. Well, we don't know what they had pre-flood, but some of those, of course, passed over pre-flood. I think pre-flood, there was a lot more knowledge than there is after the flood. I think that's pretty evident just by what we see in the megalithic structures before the flood. Now, here's something I think that is an interesting quote. This is from a book by the name of Two Babylons of Papal Worship by Alexander Hislop. He says, now this doctrine of baptismal regeneration is essentially Babylonian or pagan. Some may perhaps stumble at the idea of regeneration at all having been known in the pagan world, but if they only go to India, they will find at this day the bigoted Hindus who have never opened their eyes to Christian instruction as familiar with the term and the ideas as ourselves. Otherwise, the term regeneration. The Brahmins, that's those who worship the Brahma bull, that's their cow god. They drink the urine of the Brahma bull, and that is a very powerful thing for them. The Brahmins make it their distinguishing boast that they are twice born men, and that, as such, they are sure of eternal happiness. Now, why would they do that? Well, they think they're taking an aspect of the deity within themselves. That's Spiritism. This is practiced in every pagan culture that you can have variations. Native Americans smoked Paiute. They drank alcohol. And the reason why, they believed that they were inhaling the spirit into themselves, and that spirit did what? Made them hallucinate. And so they saw spirit beings and spirit guides, and that's kind of like what was going on in the 60s of my generation. So now he says, now the same was the case in Babylon. And there the new birth was conferred by baptism. In the Chaldean mysteries, before any instruction could be received, it was required, first of all, that the person to be initiated submit to baptism in token of blind and implicit obedience. Now, isn't this interesting that the pagans counterfeit biblical baptism? They counterfeit. But now it is intended to go a different direction. Almost all of the pagan fertility cults worship the four elements. What are they? Earth, water, wind, and fire. Earth, water, wind, and fire. And they do so in some form because they viewed the four elements as physical expressions of the gods. They were mystical miracles. They didn't understand them, but the four elements were believed to be infused with the divine essence of a god or the gods. And so when you were involved with these things, what do? You light a fire and what comes forth? Well, smoke and heat, right? But the smoke is a spiritual essence. And, the same with wind. You don't see it. It's spiritual, right? But it moves things. It warms things up if it's hot out, cools things down if it's cold. It's a mystical thing. We don't really understand it. So is it true of water. Water falls on the ground and crops come forth. So it is with earth. Earth, you take it, there's nothing there. But when it can put a seed in it and you water it, and fertilize it, and a miracle takes place. Well, we understand all that. It's all what do we call that again? Procreation. But they saw this as creative act of God. And so all of this comes into pagan Christianity, and it's paganized Christianity. Here's another quote. This is from a guy, he's a Seventh-day Adventist, but he's done some good research. Of course, I don't agree with Seventh-day Adventism. This is from a book called Paganism Surviving in Christianity, and it's Louis Abram Herbert is the guy's name. And I would disagree with most of the theology of Seventh-day Adventists, but some of their research this guy's research is pretty good. He says, various forms of baptism and the doctrine of baptismal regeneration were common characteristics of pagan religion before the birth of Christ. Now, we all know that to be true. Everybody who does any research into paganism knows this is true. The pagan water worship cult is secondary only to sun worship. We know that to be true. In age and extent. And its native home was in the East, but it appears in all periods and both hemispheres. It had two phrases, of water as an object of worship and as a means of inspiration, and water used in religious ceremonies to produce spiritual purity. And these phases often mingled with each other. Now, it's one thing to understand purification, but it's another thing to infuse the properties of water with something more than what God has said. They cleanse the body, but they cannot cleanse the soul. But the pagans believed they could cleanse both the body and the soul. And Peter addresses not the washing of the filth of the flesh, but the answer of a good conscience towards God, as it was water baptism and spirit baptism. And he says this, the reverence for water and faith in its cleansing efficacy, baptism regeneration, arose from the idea that it was permeated by the divine essence, from which it had supernatural power to enlighten and purify the soul, without regard to the spiritual state of the candidate. The doctrine of baptismal regeneration was transferred to the Christianity before the close of the 2nd century. It's about the time of Constantine. And through it, the church was filled rapidly with baptized but unconverted pagans. Sun worship and water worship were closely united in the pagan cultus as they were in the corrupted Christian baptism. And this, of course, came into Christianity through Constantine, was systematized by Augustine. Now, these are all things that we need to know, because the vast majority of people within our community who go to church every Sunday, who don't have a clue of any of this, they're just believing what their preacher told them. In fact, their preacher don't even know why they do it. In fact, you ask them, they say, well, this is a mystery to us. We don't really understand this. But the foundations of it is not in the Bible, it's in paganism. So nowhere is the mysticism, the mystery of infant baptism and baptismal regeneration better exemplified than in the statements of Augustine of Hippo. Now, where is Hippo? It's in northern Africa, in Egypt. So this is where Augustine was. He's part of the Alexandrian, not the Byzantine Empire. He's part of the Alexandrian Empire. And he lived 354 to 450, so shortly after Constantine declared the world Christian. Augustine was converted. He was a converted pagan. And he integrated many pagan theological ideas in with his false Christianity, pseudo-Christianity. And marrying these things together, you don't, when you come to Christianity, you repent of everything that is not Christian. And you hold to a Bible alone position, where I'm going to get everything I believe from the Bible. And as you discover certain things aren't what the Bible teaches, you throw them away. But that's not what Augustine practiced. He practiced what's called Aristotelian syllogism. Aristotle practiced deductive reasoning. Major premise, minor premise, conclusion. Now I'll give you an example of that. I always use this one with the Arian argument, or that God is not, that Jesus is not God. This is where the Arians use this as well. God is eternal. Jesus has a beginning. Major premise, minor premise. Does Jesus have a beginning? Yes, in history. Was he eternally the Son of God? Yes. Those are two different things. In Jesus, the God, the eternal Jehovah, became a man for the purposes of being the kinsman redeemer. But they would say, well, Jesus has a beginning, and so major premise, minor premise, conclusion, Jesus can't be God. Now that's very bad deductive reasoning. That's Aristotle's syllogism. Now this is what Augustine practiced in his theology. Instead of what we would call an inductive logic, finding truth in all of the scriptures, not bringing truth to the scripture and rationalizing. That is what Augustine did. Augustine formulated the doctrine of original sin. How many have ever heard of the doctrine of original sin? Have you studied it out? What did he teach? Well, this taught the imputation of Adam's original sin to all his descendants. And that's not true. God didn't impute Adam's sin to us. Adam brought his sin to us through seminal corruption. Adam's nature was corrupted. He was corrupted with the seed of Satan, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. And that was passed on to every single one of us seminally. Romans 5:12, by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, and death passed upon all men. For all have sinned, in Adam's sin. We all have a sin nature. Go on to chapter 6 and chapter 7 and deal with that how we overcome that. But Augustine taught the imputation of Adam's original sin to all descendants rather than a seminal corruption of humanity through a genetic transmutation of the human nature and passing a sin nature to all Adam's descendants. Now, that's a different thing. Now, if you read some of these things, you would see that they address this, but it is never addressed in a solid way. So Augustine's solution to this problem from a logical, deductive, not scriptural application of the grace of baptism, what he called the mystery of the sacrament, was the adaptation of the pagan idea of exorcism in infant baptism. You cast out the demon, the seed of Satan that is in there. It's inculcated in every one of us. That original sin there, you just cast him out. That's exorcism. And infant baptism, especially in Roman Catholicism, is coupled with exorcism. So Augustine's view of infant baptism is almost the same as the historical pagan practice of infant baptism practiced around the world by various pagan sects. Now, Alexander Hislop, in his book, The Two Babylons, described the practice here he quotes a book called Mexico, Volume 3, and this quote is on pages 339 through 340, regarding Roman Catholic missionaries in Mexico among the pagan Indians. And Prescott described the practice of infant baptism among the pagan Indians. He says, I'll read it in a minute. As you read this, keep in mind that what is being described is not infant baptism as commonly practiced within pagan Christianity, but is part of the ancient rituals of pagan sun worship. So what he was describing is the infant baptism of pagan sun worship. The Roman Catholic missionaries, when they watched this, were astonished by the pagan practice that they saw being administered, because before their eyes, the similarity it had to their own ritual practices of infant baptism was almost identical. And so the reason behind the similarity is because infant baptism of Roman Catholicism and Augustine of Hippo has pagan origins, not scriptural. Now listen to this quote. It's quite lengthy. And when everything now, he's describing what they saw in this sun worship infant baptism. When everything necessary for the baptism had been made ready, all the relations of the child were assembled, and the midwife, that was the woman who helped bring the child into the world, who was the person that performed the rite of baptism, was summoned. Now, so the midwife was part of this. And at early dawn, they met together in the courtyard of the house when the sun had risen. The midwife, taking the child in her arms, called for an earthen vessel of water, while those about her placed the ornaments which had been prepared for baptism in the midst of the court. To perform the rite of baptism, she placed herself with her face toward the west and immediately began to go through a certain ceremony. Now, this is a very lengthy quote. You see the 3 dots there, it means I'm skipping a bunch of it. And we'll jump down here. And after this, she sprinkled water on the head of the infant, saying, O my child, take and receive the water of the Lord of the world, which is our life, which is given for the increasing and renewing of our body. It is to wash and to purify. I pray that these heavenly drops may enter into your body and dwell there, that they may destroy and remove from you all the evil and sin which was given you before the beginning of the world, since all of us are under its power. Now, 3 periods. She then washed the body of the child with water and spoke in this manner. Whensoever thou comest, thou art hurtful to this child, leave him and depart from him. That's exorcism. For he now liveth anew and is born anew. Regeneration. Now he is purified and cleansed afresh. And our mother, this is the sun god, the mother of the sun goddess, Chalkavekku, the goddess of water, of the sun god and the goddess of water, bringeth him into the world. Having thus prayed, the midwife took the child in both hands and in lifting him towards heaven. You see this in Catholic baptisms. O Lord, speaking to her form of the sun god, Woden, would have been that in Mexico. Thou seest here thy creature whom thou hast sent into the world, this place of sorrow, suffering, and penitence. Grant him, O Lord, thy gifts and inspiration, for thou art the great God, and with thee is the great goddess. That's infant baptism. Practiced by the pagans all over the world. I challenge you to go in and find, and you can find this pretty much on the internet, and find a rite of Roman Catholic baptism. Now, what did Reformed do? They just cleaned it up. They take away some of this stuff, but it's still there in their belief system. Now, compare this pagan statement on pagan infant baptism to Augustine's statement on so-called Christian infant baptism and the doctrine of faith by proxy. It's called Fideus Alina, or alien faith, or faith of others. Integrating paganism into Christianity created more mysteries and resolved none. Listen to what he says. Now, inasmuch as infants are not held bound by any sins of their own actual life, it is a guilt of original sin. Otherwise, Adam's sin imputed to the children, not seminally, but actually imputed by God, which is healed in them by the grace of him, God, who saves them by the labor of regeneration. The labor is where you're washed, the washing labor. And that will take Colossians 3:15, the washing of regeneration there, and make it water baptism. If Fideus Alina, or faith, alien faith, the faith of someone else, faith by proxy, solves the problem of the infant's lack of faith, it opens up a new question. This is a quote from a website called Pedagorman. It's an interesting site. There's a lot of information on it. But they ask this. It says, if Fideus Alina solves the problem of the infant's lack of faith, it opens a new question. Who actually does the believing? The early scholastics reckoned with the possibility that parents or sponsors may not really believe. So what if you're saved by the alien faith of your parents, but what if your parents don't believe? They're not really believers, but they go through the baptism because they're supposed to, right? Which is the case of most infant baptism. So the early scholastics, these are the scholars who argued how many angels could fit on the head of a pin, reckon with the possibility that parents or sponsors may not really believe. In this case, the act of believing dissolves upon the church as a whole. As Augustine had said, but what if the entire church was in error? Then said the scholastics, it is the faith of the ecclesia triumphant, the church already in heaven that suffices. So, but the church triumphant does not need faith. They does not need faith. How can it believe? Otherwise, it's already walking by sight. The church in heaven is not walking by faith anymore. So the answer here, its faith is on deposit in the treasury of merits. Look, I'm not making this stuff up, folks. They actually wrote this stuff down someplace. So the theologian spun out the strands that came from the Pandora's box that Augustine had opened. This is what happens when you try to explain something you don't even understand. It's very simple. There's no regeneration in water. Now, any questions or comments on all of this today? This stuff we get, it is rather humorous to look at this stuff, but it's also very sad. And the reason why it's sad is because most people don't investigate this at all. They have no idea. I ask people, I said, well, why do you think that water can regenerate? Well, this is what I've always been taught. Well, have you ever investigated if it's true? Have you ever researched where that came from? Do you find it in the Bible? You see, you can take a Bible verse, you can impose an idea upon it, and you can make a Bible verse say anything you want it to say. And that's what Luther's large catechism does. Takes a few Bible verses by the washing of regeneration, John chapter 3, and the water birth there's got to be, baptism. No, it's not. You've imposed something on the text. And it's not biblical at all. Now we're going to pick up there, I think, next week and stop right here. Any questions, comments, criticisms? Noel?
It seems to me that every false religion is a branch of the same tree.
Exactly.
All true faith in God is so clearly distinguished from each other.
Yeah, they take a nugget of something mentioned in the Bible, and then they corrupt it. That's what Satan does. And he's done it for centuries, for millennia. He does the same thing. And God clarifies most of these things. I think that's what the interesting thing, and I think there's seven or eight uses of the word mystery in the New Testament. Every one is an explanation of what man considered a mystery. Now it's clarified, it's not a mystery anymore. And that is what God does. He clarifies. Satan confuses. God's not the author of confusion. So if there's confusion, where did it come from? It's satanic. Now, if you have a person that is teaching confusing things, that person has been influenced by Satan or satanic doctrine. And that is infant baptism. That is definitely where it is. Where does it come from again? Satan. But it is infused in paganism throughout the world. Every pagan cult practices some form of baptism. Now, God seeks to clarify it and purify the doctrine. And it's always connected to sanctification in the Bible, never to salvation. Always sanctification, never to salvation. Never once. But even within Baptist church, we make it a means to express and testify to our salvation, right? No, it's not. That's not what baptism is. Not what it's for. So get a copy of the book, Your Baptismal Water to Doctrine is Shallow. Then you'll find out that once you read the book, I had one pastor say to me, my baptismal waters were doctrinally shallow. I read the book and now they aren't anymore. And it should be, that's the way it is. But it takes literally hundreds and hundreds of hours to research most of this stuff. And we're just bringing it to you and brought it out in the, lay it out here for you. It doesn't make any difference how much I bring to you. What's important is how much you take home. How much you can take home and use in the days ahead. That's what's important. Ezra, would you close us in prayer this morning?